So concept 3 is going to have us look at the legacy of the Cold War. So you need to identify the legacy of the Cold War. So basically, in summary of the end of World War II, it brought a dramatic final shift in American foreign policy as the United States broke from its isolationist tradition to seek a permanent rule in world affairs. So that's the major overarching legacy of the Cold War that's still with us today. The predominant characteristic of this new policy was the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Containment originally emerged in response to Soviet pressure on Eastern Europe, but that doctrine was expanded by succeeding administrations to include resistance to communism everywhere it seemed to appear. A Cold War mentality shaped the United States foreign policy throughout the post-war World War era. As a result, the Korean and the Vietnam Wars were two outgrowths of this Cold War mentality or containment doctrine. At the same time the United States asserted its economic and political supremacy, it established a pattern of troubling double standards in these areas in dealing with the Soviet Union. While it was okay for the United States to establish missiles within a few miles of the Soviet border in Turkey, Kennedy was prepared to fight a nuclear war to compel the Soviets to remove their missiles from Cuba with the Cuban Missile Crisis. American aircraft in 1960 flew over, the U-2 fighters flew over the airspace of the Soviet Union at a time when a Soviet attempt to duplicate that feat in American airspace would have meant a major confrontation, possibly a nuclear war. The United States asserted its right to maintain a permanent fleet in the Mediterranean, but a small fleet of Soviets anywhere in the Pacific or the Atlantic near the United States would have meant a hot war with the United States. The United States began building military alliances in the Middle East in 1950, but any attempts for the Soviets to form alliances with Syria, Iran would have been seen as Soviet penetration and grounds for a possible war with the United States. So it was easy to justify a double standard for U.S. policymakers and Americans alike because of ideology. For example, when the United States took over Britain's oil concessions in Iran, Roosevelt was thrilled at the chance to use Iran as an example of, quote, what we could do by an unselfish American policy, unquote. So, in other words, what is imperialism when done by another country is development when done by the United States. So, fighting a worldwide battle against communism had strong domestic repercussions that need to be examined. The new importance of foreign affairs enhanced the power of the president greatly. So we can see this continued expansion of the executive during the Cold War. Second, what Eisenhower called the creation of the military-industrial complex led to the development of a partnership between big business and the Pentagon. This partnership became independent of large expenditures for the production of war goods. So Lockheed Martin is making huge profits in the dynamic of the Cold War. And this causes a dynamic. It's called the military-industrial complex, and it's made of three legs. One, you have the federal government, Congress, which allocates funds. Two, you have industry. And three, you have the military, all working in collusion with each other and creating this dynamic in which Eisenhower was quite concerned that the need for both profits and political viability for Congress members would push foreign policy rather than actual threats to American interests, right? So, in other words, there are people in Lockheed Martin or whatever, Boeing, whatever kind of industry that's producing weapons, they can make a profit. And congressmen become subjected to this dynamic because, and congresswomen alike, because, and this is still going on today, because contracts with major weapon manufacturers means jobs in many key industries throughout the United States. And to cancel orders for maybe obsolete weapons that we don't need anymore would mean the closing of factories, which would mean losing jobs, which would probably mean losing votes for that particular congressperson who supported the hypothetical discontinuing of weapon systems. These growing defense expenditures under the military-industrial complex took up an ever larger part of the gross national product. It also led to paying for defense spending through higher taxes and growing deficits, which took money away from social and domestic needs. Let's just watch a little bit of Eisenhower's speech and a little explanation on it real quick. So again, the speech about to watch here is Eisenhower's farewell address to the American people, where he warns the American people about the military-industrial complex. This is very interesting, very strange, but an interesting and a speech that still has a lot of life to it. A lot of people look to the speech as one of the most important speeches given by an American president in the later 20th century. It was a very strange speech because here he is on his way out saying, you know, God bless America, God bless you, God bless me, all that kind of stuff. But then he comes in and he says, look out for the military-industrial complex. So let's just watch this a little bit just to get a sense of what it is. And then in class we'll watch a film that'll dive into this a little bit more called Why We Fight.
I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell.
This speech did not get very much attention. When a new president is coming to power, as John Kennedy was, the spotlight was not on Dwight Eisenhower.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions.
There was a feeling at the time that this must have been written by some speechwriter who just sneaked into the speech.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
3 months ago, we got contacted by a family up in Minnesota saying that we have documents from Malcolm Moose. He was responsible in part for drafting the military-industrial complex speech.
These new papers give us written evidence that this was not just some caprice of Eisenhower's or something by some speechwriter.
You see the evolution of the speech from May 1959 to 1961.
And he wanted to give this speech for a long time, 2 years.
Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea.
There was one person in Dwight Eisenhower's life whom he really confided almost everything to, and that was his brother Milton.
There's one particular document where the speechwriters had already drafted their version of the speech, only to see Milton come along and totally revamp what had already been written.
When Milton Eisenhower was taking notes and writing things on the drafts of these speeches, the speechwriters knew that it wasn't Milton talking, it was Ike.
The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
He would see magazines with advertisements for some new warplane or some bomb, and he got so angry he'd take the magazine and throw it into the fireplace of the Oval Office because he felt that defense spending should not be something that would be encouraged by companies who are seeking commercial gain.
We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
There is an interesting document. It shows that the farewell speech will be made to Congress. But yet, President Eisenhower decided, no, he was going to address the people.
Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
One test of how well a president speaks is how long the speech lives. Here we are 50 years later, we're still talking about this speech.
Now, on Friday noon, I am to become a private citizen. I am proud to do so. I look forward to it. Thank you, and good night.
By the time Eisenhower is president, there is a huge new flow of cash into defense industries.
He was the first to acknowledge that a permanent military establishment would be required during this period, but that unless we could find some kind of breakthrough, that in fact it would end up creating a terrible cost.
The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities.
It has 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 population. It has 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals.
We pay for a single fighter plane with 500,000 bushels of wheat.
We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people.
This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron.
My father, as president, had strong guiding principles. He used to say, modern weapons take food from the hungry and shelter from the homeless. And so he was fighting with the Pentagon all the time for asking for too much and Congress for giving it to him.
I don't think we should pay 1 cent for defense more than we have to.
Well, Eisenhower saw us starting to build program after program that was just out of control. And his own ability to shape national security policy was being hemmed in by these forces he couldn't control, and he was the president.
On at least one occasion, Eisenhower was heard to say by those in the room, "God help this country when somebody sits at this desk who doesn't know as much about the military as I do."
My fellow Americans, this evening I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell, and to share a few final thoughts with you, my countrymen. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
You have to realize this is one of the great presidents, great military leaders, on his way out the door. And at the end of his second term, he says, by the way, watch out for the military-industrial complex.
People know that he invented the phrase military-industrial complex, but very rarely do you see the whole thing and realize how utterly strident his warning was. I think it's one of the most profound statements ever made by an American president.
We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.